There is a photograph that hangs now in the long gallery of the old barracks, framed in plain black wood among the regimental honors, and men who never knew the story stop before it every day without understanding what they are looking at. It shows the wide stone portico of the Eldermore Opera House on a wet spring night, the great columns rising into rain, the lamps smeared to gold by the weather. In the middle of the frame there is a knot of red-coated guardsmen, 6 of them, their backs turned to the camera, their bearskins slick and shining, their bodies pressed together into a single curved wall. They are facing outward into a wall of light and hands and lenses, and you cannot see the woman they are shielding at all. That is the point of it. You are not meant to see her. You are meant to understand that she is there, small and safe, behind 6 men who decided in the space of a single breath that their bodies were worth more than their orders. I'm the man who took no glory that night, because I was standing where the camera was, 40 feet back, holding a line of my own and watching it all happen and unable to reach them in time. My name is Wren Halloran, and I served 11 years in the household guard of the Royal House of Harrogate, and I have told this story exactly twice in my life. Once to a board of inquiry that wanted to know why 6 of my brothers had broken every rule of the ceremonial book. And once now to you, because the man at the center of that red wall never told it himself, and someone ought to, before all of us who saw it are gone. His name was Aldous Frey, Corporal Aldous Frey of the 2nd Section, 28 years old that spring, a quiet man from the northern moors who had come to the guard the way a stone comes to a riverbed, by falling and settling and being worn smooth by the current until you could not imagine the place without him. He was not the tallest man in the section, nor the loudest, nor the one the officers marked for advancement. He was the one you wanted on your left in a crowd. That is a specific kind of man, and there are fewer of them than you would think. But I am ahead of myself. Let me set the night down properly, because the order of things is the whole of it, and if you do not understand what the night was supposed to be, you will not understand how completely it broke. It was the spring gala of the Eldermore Royal Opera, the founders' benefit they called it, a charity night that filled the opera house with the great and the moneyed of the kingdom and raised a fortune each year for the children's hospitals of the realm. It was, on paper, the softest duty in the calendar. No procession through open streets, no mounted vanguard, no 10-mile route to secure. A single building, a single arrival, a single departure. The guests came in their motor cars up the curved drive, walked 40 feet of red carpet under the great portico, and vanished inside into warmth and music. The guard's whole task was to hold the carpet, a thin lane of dignity between the arriving royals and the crowd of press and admirers who gathered behind the velvet ropes to watch them come. I had held that carpet 4 years running. It was, I will admit, a duty I had come to take lightly. The danger at a gala is not a danger of bodies, it is a danger of embarrassment, a drunk guest, a photographer who leans too far, a protester with a placard who shouts something and is walked away by 2 men before the cameras can catch more than his open mouth. You dressed in your best, you stood your 40 feet of rope, you kept the line straight and the smiles moving, and by 11 you were back in barracks with your boots off. Soft duty, the softest. But that spring the calendar had done a cruel thing, though none of us saw it as cruel at the time. The founders' benefit fell 3 nights after a story had broken in every paper in the kingdom. A story about the royal house, and about a woman, and about a quarrel that was never supposed to leave the palace walls. I will tell you the shape of it, because you cannot understand the crowd that gathered that night unless you understand what had put them in a fever. The woman at the center of the story was Princess Elara. You will have heard of her even if you have never set foot in Eldermore, because she was the kind of figure that a whole people fastens its heart to and does not let go. She was King Alaric's daughter by his first wife, the late Queen Isolde, dead these many years, and if you had known Isolde, they said, you would have wept to see how the mother lived on in the girl. The same warmth, the same trick of remembering a stranger's name a year after she had heard it once, the same way of looking at a frightened person that made them feel, for one moment, like the only soul in the room. The kingdom did not merely respect Princess Elara. It loved her, in the plain and helpless way people love a thing that is good and does not seem to know it is good. And there was another woman in the house, and the whole story that had broken that week was, at bottom, the story of the space between the two of them. Her name was Morwenna. Queen Consort Morwenna, the king's second wife, married to him years after Isolde's death, when grief had hollowed him out and made him glad of any hand that offered to fill the emptiness. She was a handsome woman in a cold and lacquered way, the kind of beauty that photographs perfectly and warms nothing. She had brought 2 grown children of her own into the house, Lord Cassius, her son, and Lady Verena, her daughter, and she had spent her years since the marriage doing what such women do, which is arranging. She arranged seating. She arranged invitations. She arranged which face stood where in the photographs, and which name appeared first in the programs, and which daughter of the house was seen, and which was, gently and deniably, tucked into the shadow at the edge of the frame. The face she could not arrange into shadow was Elara's. That was the wound at the center of everything. Every cheer the people gave the princess was a cheer Morwenna would never earn. Every paper rose thrown at Elara's feet was a rose that had not been thrown at hers. And a woman like Morwenna does not forgive a mirror for showing her what she lacks. The story that had broken that week, I will not dignify it by repeating the worst of it, for most of it was invention dressed as fact, concerned a scene said to have taken place at a private dinner, in which the Queen Consort had spoken to the princess in a way no stepmother should speak to a grieving girl, and in which something the late Queen Isolde had left to her daughter had gone missing from the room where it was kept. A brooch, some said. A letter, said others. It hardly mattered which. What mattered was that the papers had it, and the papers had made of it a war between the 2 women, and the people of the kingdom, who loved the princess and had never trusted the Queen Consort, had chosen their side before the ink was dry. So the founder's benefit that year was not going to be a soft night. The whole kingdom knew Elara would be there, because Elara had insisted on going. She was the patron of the very children's hospitals the gala served, and she would not let a scandal keep her from a duty she had held for years. And the whole kingdom knew Morwenna would be there too, because Morwenna could not be seen to hide, and because, this we learned only later, she had a purpose of her own for the night that had nothing to do with charity. The crowd that gathered outside the opera house that evening was not the usual gala crowd. It was 3 times the size. It stretched from the velvet ropes back across the whole of the opera square and down the 2 streets that fed it, and it had come not to admire but to see, to lay eyes on the princess they had read about, to shout their love at her and their fury at the woman they blamed, to be present at the war the papers had promised them. And it had come, most of it with phones and cameras raised, so that the whole square was a field of small cold lights held up in the rain, thousands of them, each one hunting a face. I want you to hold that image, because it is the thing that made the night dangerous, and it is the thing no one had planned for. We had planned for protesters. We had planned for a drunk. We had not planned for love, for the terrible physical force of 10,000 people who each meant no harm at all, pressing forward together toward a single small woman, because each of them, individually, only wanted to be a little closer to something good. The section commander that night was a captain named Osric Vale, a good officer of the parade ground kind, whose gift was for making a line look perfect, and whose blind spot was for what a line was actually for. He had 6 men under him on the carpet proper, Frey among them, and another dozen of us spread back through the square holding the outer barriers, and he had walked the ground that afternoon and pronounced himself satisfied. The ropes were up. The lane was clear. The arrivals would come in their order, the least of them first, the king and his house last, and Princess Elara, because the papers had made her the center of everything, would arrive at the very end, alone in her car, so that the cameras that had come for her would have their moment and then it would be done. I remember Frey saying something about that in the muster room while we dressed. He was cleaning his gloves. He was always cleaning something, Frey. Stillness made him restless, and he filled it with small, careful work, and he said, in that flat northern way of his that never rose or fell, "They've put her last. So every eye in that square will be waiting on one car." Vale passing heard it, and he said, "And a crowd that's waited 2 hours for one car," Frey said, not looking up, "is a different animal than a crowd watching 20. Vale laughed. He was not a cruel man, only a certain one. "It's a gala, corporal," he said, "not a siege. Hold your rope and smile." Frey said nothing more. He finished his gloves. But I saw him, before we went out, do a thing I had seen him do only twice before, both times before something went wrong. He loosened the chin strap of his bearskin 1 notch, and he flexed his shoulders under the red wool as a man does when he is making sure his body will answer him. He was getting ready. I did not know for what. I am not sure he did either. But some men can feel the weather changing before the first drop falls, and Frey was one of them. We went out into the rain a little after 7. The first hour was as soft as promised. The lesser guests came up the drive, the patrons and the players, the men of business who had bought a table, the singers who would perform, a scattering of the minor nobility. They came in their finery under the great lit portico. They smiled and waved at the crowd. The crowd cheered politely and hunted with its cameras for a face worth keeping, and finding none, sagged back into its waiting. I stood my post at the outer barrier, 40 feet back and to the left of the carpet's foot, and I watched the square breathe, and I did not like it. I have stood in a lot of crowds. You learn to read them the way a farmer reads a sky. A happy crowd is slack in it. It sways, it drifts, it lets its children wander a few feet and calls them back lazily. This crowd had no slack. It had packed itself tight against the ropes from the first, and it stayed tight, and it did not sway. It pressed steadily forward, as though the whole mass of it were leaning very slowly against a door. And every time a car came up the drive, a low sound went through it, not cheering, not yet, but a kind of collective intake of breath, a readiness. And then the sound fell again when the face proved to be the wrong one, and the leaning resumed, a little harder than before. They were saving themselves. All that force, all that longing, banked in building for the one car that had been put last. Frey was right, and Vale was wrong, and I stood at my rope and felt the truth of it in the pit of my stomach an hour before the truth arrived. The house began to come at 8:30. Lord Cassius first, Morwenna's smooth and hungry son, stepping out of his car with the little turn of the head that told you he was checking which cameras had found him. Then Lady Verena, quiet as ever, her eyes moving over the crowd in a way I did not like and could not name. Then the Crown Prince, Rowan, Elara's full brother, Isolde's son, a serious young man who lifted a hand to the crowd and got a real cheer for it, for the people had not forgotten whose son he was. Then the king himself, Alaric, silver-headed and slow, and the roar that went up for him was the roar a people gives a father it is worried about, half love and half grief. And then second to last, the Queen Consort. Morwenna came up the drive in a long, dark car, and she stepped out of it under the lit portico in a gown the color of a bruise, and she stood a moment at the foot of the carpet with her chin lifted, giving the cameras their shot, giving the crowd its chance to love her. The crowd did not love her. I have never heard a sound quite like the one the square made when Morwenna stepped onto that carpet. It was not booing. The people of Eldermore were too well-mannered or too frightened for that. It was worse. It was silence. 10,000 people who had cheered the king and cheered the prince simply stopped, all at once, and let her walk the 40 feet of red carpet in a quiet so total you could hear the rain hitting the canvas awning and the click of her own heels on the stone. She walked it with her head high and her smile fixed, and she did not hurry, and I will give her this. It took a kind of iron to walk that long, cold silence and not break stride. But I saw her face as she passed the foot of my barrier, and the smile was a thing hung on the front of her like a mask on a nail, and behind it, her eyes were flat and black and burning, and they were fixed not on the crowd and not on the cameras but on the empty drive behind her, where in a few minutes the last car would come. She knew. She had heard the silence they gave her, and she had heard, in her memory, the roar they would give the girl who came after her, and she went inside the opera house carrying that comparison like a coal in her hand. I thought, watching her go, this is a woman who has been humiliated in front of her whole kingdom, and who blames one person for it, and who is about to spend the evening in the same building as that person. I did not yet know the half of it. I did not know what she had arranged. The drive stood empty for a long 5 minutes, and the crowd, which had banked its whole force for 2 hours, felt the moment coming and began, very slowly, very quietly, to move. It began at the back. That is the thing about a crowd surge that no one who has not stood in one can understand. The danger never comes from the people you can see. The front rows, the ones pressed against the velvet ropes, they are not the problem. They can see everything, they have their spot, they are content. The problem is the thousands behind them, the ones who came late and stand in the dark at the square's far edge and can see nothing but the backs of heads. When the moment they have waited 2 hours for arrives, every one of those people, all at once, without a word passing between them, decides to move forward, and each of them only pushes the person in front of them a little. But there are 10,000 of them, and a little, multiplied 10,000 times, becomes a wall of force that no barrier of rope and no line of men was ever built to hold. I felt it before I saw the car. I felt the barrier I was holding, a length of steel rail on iron feet, a thing I could ordinarily lean on with my whole weight, begin, very gently, to slide. The rain-slick stone gave it no grip. Behind it the front rows were being pushed against it by the rows behind them, and those by the rows behind them, and the whole pressure of the square was coming at last to rest on a few dozen guardsmen and a few hundred yards of rope. "Steady the line!" That was Vale up at the carpet, his voice sharp with the first edge of a man realizing his afternoon satisfaction had been built on nothing. "Steady! Take up the slack on the north ropes." And then the last car turned in off the square, up the curved drive, and its headlamp swept the front of the opera house, and the crowd saw it, and the 2 hours of banked and waiting force came out of 10,000 throats at once. I cannot describe the sound to you and do it justice. It was not a cheer. A cheer is a thing a crowd does. This was a thing that happened to the crowd, a wave that started at the front where they could see the car and rolled backward, and then came forward again doubled, love and longing, and the sheer animal joy of 10,000 people who had waited in the rain for the one person they had come to see, and who had at last seen her. It went through the square and up through the stone, and I felt it in the rail under my hands and in the fillings of my teeth. And on the crest of that sound, the whole crowd surged. The car stopped at the foot of the carpet, the door opened, and Princess Elara stepped out into the rain and the light and the roar, in a gown the pale silver gray of a dove's wing, and she lifted her face to the crowd and smiled, and the sound doubled again. She should not have stopped. I have thought about that 1,000 times. The plan Vale had walked that afternoon, the plan I had read had her stepping from the car and going straight up the carpet, 40 feet, 10 seconds, and inside. But Elara was Elara. She saw the crowd that had waited in the rain for her. She saw the thousands of small lit faces hunting for her through the dark, and she could no more walk past them without a word than she could stop her own heart. She stopped at the foot of the carpet and she turned to the crowd, and she lifted her hand, and she gave them the thing they had come for herself, unhurried, unafraid, glad to see them. It was the most human thing in the world, and it was the moment the night broke. Because when she stopped, the front of the crowd tried to stop too, to hold at the ropes, to have their moment. But the back of the crowd did not know she had stopped. The back of the crowd only knew that the wait was over and the princess was here, and it pushed. And the front of the crowd, which had been holding the ropes, was driven over them. The north barrier went first. I heard it before I saw it, a shriek of steel feet skidding on wet stone, and then a sound like a great sigh as 40 feet of railing folded and went down, and the front rank of the crowd, no longer held, spilled forward off the curb and onto the edge of the carpet itself. Not because they meant to, but because there was suddenly nothing to stop them and 10,000 people behind them still pushing. A woman went down. I saw her go, saw the gap open where she had been standing, saw the people behind stumble into it and over it. A child's voice, high, frightened, cut through the roar and was swallowed. The velvet rope, torn from its posts, whipped across the carpet like a snake. And in the middle of it, 40 feet from me, stood Princess Elara, alone, her hand still half raised, her smile just beginning to break into something else as she understood a half second before anyone else, that the love had turned into a flood, and the flood was coming for her. I was too far. That is the thing I have had to live with. I was 40 feet back at my own broken barrier with 3 men down in front of me and a woman I was trying to pull up out of the crush, and between me and the princess was a churning mass of bodies I could no more cross than I could cross a river in spate. I shouted her name. I do not think she heard it. No one could have heard anything in that sound. But Aldous Frey was 6 feet from her. Frey had been standing at the head of the carpet on the north side, the side the barrier had failed on. And Frey, who had loosened his chin strap in the muster room, who had felt the weather turning an hour before the first drop fell, Frey was already moving before the rail hit the ground. I have watched the footage since, the grainy footage from a dozen phones, slowed down frame by frame in the inquiry room, and you can see it. While every other man on that carpet was still turning toward the sound of the barrier going down, still processing what his eyes were telling him, Frey was already 3 steps into his run, straight for the princess, because he had not waited to understand the danger. He had trusted his own unease. He had been getting ready for an hour. He reached her as the first of the crowd reached the carpet, and here is where the training and the man met, and where the man won. The book, the ceremonial book, the one they beat into you on the drill square, says a great many things about what a guardsman does when a crowd breaks. It says hold your post. It says await the command of your officer. It says do not lay hands upon a member of the royal house except to move them from immediate danger, and then only with such force as the danger requires and no more. It is a good book, written by careful men, and it is written for a world in which there is time to think. Frey had no time to think. He had a princess in the open and a flood coming, and one body, his own, to put between them. So he did the thing the book does not have a page for. He did not try to pull her back up the carpet. There was no time, and the crowd was already between them and the doors. He did not draw the crowd's attention with a shout. The crowd was past attention. He put his back to her, his back, mind you, so that his eyes were on the danger and his body was the wall, and he wrapped his left arm around behind her to gather her in against the pillar of himself, and he braced his boots on the wet stone, and he became, in the space of one breath, the only thing standing between Princess Elara and 10,000 people who loved her too much. And then he shouted, not a word of alarm, a word of command, in a voice I heard 40 feet away over the roar. A voice that came up out of him from somewhere below the rain and the noise, flat and northern and enormous. On the princess, shield. It was 2 words the book did not contain, but every man of the second section knew what they meant, because Frey had made them mean it. He had done a thing, in the long, soft months of gala duty, that no officer had ordered him to do. On the quiet nights at the back of the muster room, he had drilled his section, 5 men who trusted him, in what to do if the worst ever came, if a line ever failed and a royal was ever left in the open. He had invented it himself, this drill, and named it himself, and the officers had never known, because it was not in the book, and Frey was not a man who advertised. The word was shield, and the shape of it was a thing the 5 of them could form in under 2 seconds, and they had formed it, laughing, 100 times on quiet nights, never once believing they would form it for real. They believed it now. From 5 different points along that carpet, 5 red-coated men turned as one at the word and drove toward the center. Sergeant Pierre's loom came from the doors. Ansel Rook and young Doran Sabe came from the south side, cutting across the carpet against the tide. Old Havard Crane, the section's graybeard, 20 years in and a knee that ached before rain, came slower but came, shoving through with a strength his years had not taken. And they reached Frey and the princess in the churning middle of it, and they did the thing they had drilled in the dark, and they made the shield. I have called it a wall. It was better than a wall. A wall is flat and a flat thing is pushed over. What Frey had drilled them to make was a curve. 6 men shoulder to shoulder in an arc, their backs to the one they guarded, their bodies angled outward and slightly down, each man's shoulder locked behind the next man's, so that the whole crowd's force, when it came, struck a rounded surface that turned it and spread it and passed it along the curve instead of caving it in. It is the shape of an arch, and an arch is the strongest thing men ever learned to build, because it takes a weight that would crush a wall and turns it into a thing that only presses the stones tighter together. Frey had known that. I do not know how a corporal from the northern moors came to understand the physics of an arch, but he had, and he had built one out of living men, and it held. The crowd hid it. I watched it from 40 feet, still fighting my own small battle at the broken north rail, and I have never seen anything like it and I hope never to again. The full weight of the surge, the whole banked force of 10,000 people, released, came down on that curve of 6 men, and the 6 men bent, and the 6 men did not break. Their bearskins went down as they braced, their heads lowered like men walking into a gale, and the front of the crowd broke over them and around them the way a sea breaks over a rock, and the men behind held the men in front, and the arch held the crowd, and in the small still center of it, in the one place in that whole roaring square where nothing moved, stood Princess Elara, gathered in against the pillar of Frey's back with his arm around her, safe. She told me, long afterward, for she and I became something like friends in the years that followed on the strength of that night, that the strangest thing about it was the quiet. Outside the shield, she said, was the loudest thing she had ever heard, a wall of noise so total it had no edges. But inside the shield, in the small dark space the 6 men made with their bodies, it was almost quiet. She could hear Frey breathing. She could hear him counting under his breath, low and steady, the way you count to keep a frightened animal calm, or to keep yourself calm, which is the same thing done for a different soul. She could smell wet wool and rain and the leather of his glove. And she said that in that small dark space, with the whole world coming apart 6 inches away, she was not afraid, because a man she had never spoken to had put his body around her like a father, and there are some kinds of safety the body understands before the mind can argue. But safety is not the same as rescue, and the shield was not a rescue. It was a holding action. 6 men can turn a crowd's force, but 6 men cannot walk a princess out through 10,000 pressing bodies, and every second they stood there the crowd pressed harder, and the arch, for all its strength, was made of men, and men tire, and men can be crushed as surely as walls. Frey knew it. I could see him knowing it. He had bought Elara 10 seconds, 20, a minute, but the tide was still rising, and somewhere in the next few minutes the arch would reach the limit of what living muscle can bear, and after that there was no page in any book at all. So Frey did a second thing that was not in the book. He began to move the shield. You cannot understand how hard this is unless you have tried to move a thing that is holding back a flood. To move, the arch had to give ground, and to give ground was to invite the flood in. But Frey had seen the one thing that could save them, and it was behind them, the great doors of the opera house, thrown open now, with light spilling out of them and a knot of household staff and 2 more guardsmen fighting to hold the threshold. 40 feet. The shield had to travel 40 feet backward up the carpet, through the crush, without breaking its curve, and deliver the princess to the doors. And so it went, in the strangest procession I ever witnessed, 6 men, backs bent, boots grinding on the wet stone, shuffling backward inch by inch up the red carpet, the whole roaring crowd pressing on their fronts, and in the sheltered heart of them a princess in a dove-gray gown walked backward toward safety by 6 men who could not see where they were going and steered only by Frey's voice, low and steady over the din. "With me. Half a step. Hold the curve. Half a step. Crane, you're drifting, close it. Half a step." I should tell you here, in the middle of the worst of it, the thing I learned much later about why Frey was the man he was, because it matters, and because a story that only shows you what a man did, and never why, is a poor half of a story. Aldous Frey had a sister, younger than him by 4 years, a bright, quick girl he had all but raised, for their mother had died when they were small, and their father was a moorland shepherd, more at home with sheep than with children. And when Frey was 19 and his sister 15, there had been a fair in the market town below their valley, the great summer fair, the one time of year the moor emptied itself into the town, and a fire had started in a packed hall, and the crowd had panicked, and in the crush at the single door his sister had gone down, and Frey, who had been beside her, had been swept away from her by the sheer weight of frightened bodies and could not fight his way back, and she had been trampled, and she had not lived. He never spoke of it. I had served 3 years beside him before I heard it, and I heard it not from him but from old Crane, who had known his family. But once you knew it, you understood everything about the man, why he was always cleaning something in the stillness, why he loosened his chin-strap before the weather turned, why he had drilled a shield no officer had asked for on quiet nights at the back of the muster room. Aldous Frey had spent his whole life since he was 19 years old preparing for the one thing he had failed to do at a door in a burning hall, to be the body that stood between a crowd and a person he was bound to protect. He had lost one. He was never, so long as he drew breath, going to lose another. The guard thought they had trained him. They had only given a shape and a uniform to a thing the fire had already made. So when the barrier failed at the opera house and a princess stood alone in the open, Frey did not run toward her out of duty, or out of the book, or out of any calculation at all. He ran toward her out of a promise he had made across 10 years to a girl who could no longer hear it. And I think I have always thought that in the small dark space inside the shield, counting under his breath to keep them both calm, some part of Aldous Frey was 19 again and had, at last, reached the person in time. I abandoned my own post then. The woman I had pulled up was on her feet and moving to safety, and the rail behind me was a lost cause, and I did the only useful thing left to me. I threw myself into the crowd on the north side and began fighting my way toward the doors, not to reach the shield, which I could not, but to reach the threshold ahead of it and help hold the gap it was steering for. Others were doing the same. Vale, I will say this for him, Vale had stopped commanding a parade and started fighting like a man, and he and 3 others were driving a wedge through the north crowd to widen the mouth of the doors. The whole thing had become, in the space of 90 seconds, not a ceremony but a battle, and everyone who wore the red had understood it and turned to the same work: get her inside. And through it all, up on the high steps beside the open doors, where the house had gathered when the trouble started, stood the Queen Consort Morwenna, and she watched. I did not see her face in the moment. I was in the crowd. But there were cameras that did, and I have seen the footage, and the whole kingdom saw it in the days that followed, and it is the second image from that night that hangs in the memory of everyone who lived through it. The first is the shield. The second is Morwenna's face as she watched the shield. She was not afraid. That is the thing that damned her. Every other face on those steps, the kings, the crown princes, Lady Verena's, the staffs, every one of them wore the same thing: terror for the woman in the middle of the crowd. Mouths open, hands at throats, one man already starting down the steps to help. Human faces, doing the human thing, which is to be afraid for someone in danger. Morwenna's face did none of that. She stood very still at the top of the steps in her bruise-colored gown, and she watched 6 of the king's guardsmen risk their lives to save her stepdaughter, and her expression did not move. It was not blank. Blank would have been better. Blank might have been shock. It was something worse than blank. It was the still, fixed faintly disbelieving look of a person watching a thing they had not permitted, a person to whom the danger of the princess was not a horror but an affront, the look of someone who was doing sums, who was watching the whole kingdom fall in love, all over again and more than ever, with the girl in the dove-gray gown, and was already, even as the crowd roared, calculating the cost to herself. And then, and this is the part the cameras caught that no one could quite believe, as the shield came grinding backward toward the doors and it became clear the guardsmen were going to succeed, going to bring the princess up the steps and in, Morwenna turned to the man beside her, an officer of the household staff, and she said something. Her lips moved, and whatever she said, the man's face changed, and he shook his head, and she said it again, sharper, and he shook his head again and stepped back from her. No one heard the words that night. But the man who received them heard them and remembered them, and repeated them under oath 3 weeks later in a room I was sitting in. And what the Queen Consort said, as 6 men bled and bent to save the princess, was this: "Tell them to stand down. She is causing a scene. Tell the guard to stand down and let her walk it herself." She wanted them to open the shield. I did not know that then. If I had, I do not know what I would have done, and I am glad I was spared the knowing until later, because a man cannot fight a crowd and hate a queen at the same time and do either well. In the moment, I knew only what I could see, which was that the shield was 30 feet from the doors and slowing, and that the crowd around it was not thinning but thickening, as the whole square funneled toward the one point of interest, and that the 6 men in the red arch were reaching the end of their strength. And the crowd itself had changed, and the change was the most dangerous thing of all. For the first minute the surge had been love, thoughtless, joyful, deadly love, the press of people who only wanted to be nearer to something good. But love in a crush does not stay love. When the front rows found themselves driven over the ropes and against the shield, when they felt the barrier gone and the weight of thousands at their backs and no way forward and no way back, the joy curdled into the oldest thing there is, which is fear. And a frightened crowd is a different beast entirely from a joyful one. A joyful crowd pushes toward a thing it wants. A frightened crowd pushes away from a thing it dreads, and there is no reasoning with it and no appeasing it, because it is no longer thousands of people but one great blind animal trying to save itself. I heard the sound of it change. The roar that had been a cheer became, in the space of half a minute, something with an edge of panic in it. Screams now threaded through it, the high, sharp screams of people who have felt the ground shift under them in a crowd and understood, in their bodies before their minds, exactly how a person dies in one. A marshal's whistle shrilled somewhere and was swallowed. Somewhere near me a man was bellowing back, "Get back," at people who could not have gone back if their lives depended on it, which they did. And the whole of that fear came down, wave on wave, on the 6 men and the arch, so that they were no longer holding back love but holding back terror, which is heavier. You could see it in them now. The arch had held its perfect curve for the first minute, now it was ragged. Doran, the youngest, the one barely a year off the drill square, had a great smear of mud up the side of his white breeches, and his mouth was open and gasping, and his eyes had the wide white look of a man discovering the true weight of the thing he had volunteered for. Old Crane's bad knee had gone. He was holding his place on the strength of his shoulders and his stubbornness, one leg dragging. Ansel Rook was bleeding from a cut above his eye where an elbow or a phone or a thrown thing had caught him, and the blood was running pink in the rain down the side of his face, and he was blinking it out of his eyes and holding on. And Frey at the center, at the point of the arch with the princess against his back. Frey was the stillest of them and therefore the one working hardest, because it is the keystone of an arch that bears the most, and he was the keystone. And I could see the cord standing out in his neck and the tremor that had come into his braced legs, and I understood that he was, very slowly, being crushed, and that he was not going to say so, and that he was going to hold that point until his body simply failed. Because the alternative was to let go of the woman behind him. There were small mercies in the middle of that horror, and I have learned over the years to hold on to them, because a man who remembers only the terror of such a night goes mad, and a man who remembers the mercy stays whole. There was a marshal in a yellow vest, a young fellow named Kettering, whose name I only learned afterward, who had been driven off his feet at the broken barrier and gone under, and who would have been trampled as surely as any of them, and 2 men of the crowd, strangers to him and to each other, big laboring men with the sense that comes to some people in a crush, planted their boots and hauled him up bodily out of the churn and passed him back over the heads of the press to safety. And never knew his name either. That happened in the middle of the worst of it. People saving people they would never meet again. It is the thing the papers never printed because it does not sell, but it is truer than anything they did print. And there was the child. I told you a child's voice had cut through the roar when the barrier first went down, high and frightened, and then swallowed, and I have to tell you that I carried the sound of it in my chest for 3 days, sick with the certainty that a little one had gone under in that crush and that I had heard it die and done nothing. I could not have done anything, I know that now, but you do not reason with a sound like that. It was only at the inquiry, 3 weeks on, that I learned the truth of it, and I will tell it to you now so you do not carry it as I did. The child had been lifted. In the first instant the barrier failed, the father, a docker from the river wards, a huge quiet man, had swung his small daughter up onto his own shoulders above the crush, and there she had ridden, wide-eyed and howling with fright but perfectly safe, a full head above the danger, held up by 2 great scarred hands the whole time. The cry I heard was fear, not harm. She went home that night and slept in her own bed. I did not know that in the moment. In the moment I only knew the sound, and it drove me harder into the crowd toward the doors, and perhaps that was its use. I tell you these things because the shield was not the only good thing done in that square that night. It was the brightest, and the one the cameras caught, and the one that changed the house. But it stood in the middle of 100 smaller braveries, ordinary people doing the decent thing in a bad moment, and the guardsman's arch was only the crown of it, not the whole. That, too, is what Elara meant to the kingdom. She was the kind of person around whom, when the worst came, people found the best in themselves. Even that night, even in that flood. And it was in that moment, the worst moment, the moment the shield was slowest and weakest and nearest to failing, that the thing came out of the crowd. I did not see it thrown. Almost no one did. In a crowd of 10,000 you cannot see one arm rise. But I saw it in flight, for 1 instant, a dark hard shape turning over in the rain and the light, coming down out of the mass of the north crowd on a flat fast line toward the center of the shield, toward the princess, toward Frey's back, toward the small dark sheltered space where Elara stood. To this day no one knows for certain who threw it or why. The inquiry decided in the end that it was most likely not malice at all, that in the crush someone had lost their footing and flung out an arm to save themselves, and let fly whatever was in their hand, which proved to be a heavy old-fashioned camera, a real one, all metal and glass, the kind a serious photographer carries. Not a weapon. An accident, most likely, a thing let go in panic. But a heavy thing thrown hard on a flat line into the back of a woman's head does not care whether it was thrown in malice or in panic. It does the same damage either way. Frey saw it. I do not know how. His back was to it. But there was a great sheet of glass in the front of the opera house, a lit window beside the doors, and I think the inquiry thought that he saw it reflected, saw the dark shape drop out of the crowd in the mirror of that lit glass in the last quarter-second before it arrived. And a quarter-second is not enough time to think. It is barely enough time to move. But Frey had spent his whole life making his body answer faster than his thought, cleaning gloves in the muster room, drilling a shield no one had asked for, getting ready, always getting ready for exactly this, and his body answered now. He did not duck. Ducking would have opened the shield and exposed the princess. He did the opposite. He turned inside the arch in the one small space he had, and he pulled Elara down and in against his chest, folding his whole body over her, his bearskin and his shoulders and his bent back a roof above her, and he took the thing where it came. It struck him across the back of the shoulders, high, at the base of the neck below the fur of the bearskin. I heard it from 20 feet, a flat, sickening, meaty crack that I have never forgotten, a sound with no rain in it, a sound of metal on a man. Frey's whole body jerked with the force of it. His braced legs buckled. And for one terrible heartbeat, the keystone of the arch went down onto one knee, and the whole shield sagged inward around him, and the crowd's weight came pressing into the gap. And I thought, everyone who saw it thought, that it was over, that the arch had lost its center and would cave, and that the woman inside it would be lost under the flood. It did not cave, because the 5 other men, feeling their center go, did the thing that only men who trust one another can do. They did not break to save themselves. They tightened. Piers loomed through his arm across the gap where Frey had knelt and took the weight Frey had been taking. Ansel and Doran on either side drove their shoulders in and closed the arch over the top of their fallen corporal, so that Frey, down on one knee with the princess folded under him, became not a hole in the wall but the deepest and most sheltered point of it, a man brought low still doing his work at the very bottom of the pile. And old Crane, bad knee and all, planted himself at the point of the arch where Frey had stood and became the new keystone, roaring something wordless up into the rain, and the shield, which should have broken, instead pulled tighter around its wounded heart and held. And Frey, who had just taken a blow across the neck that would have felled an ox, who was down on one knee in the mud with his ears ringing, and his arm gone half numb, Frey got up. I watched him do it. I had reached the edge of the doors by then, and I was 10 feet away, close enough to see his face, and I will carry the sight of it to my grave. He got one boot under himself, and then the other, gathering the princess up with him as he rose, and he set his shoulder back into the point of the arch beside Crane, and he took up his place again, and he found his voice, which was thinner now and cracked but still flat, still steady, still northern, and he said the same 3 words he had been saying for 2 minutes. Half a step. And the shield moved, half a step and another. And I and Vale and the men at the doors tore the last of the crowd out of the way and widened the threshold, and the arch of 6 men came grinding up the last of the red carpet, and up the 3 broad steps, and in through the great doors of the opera house, and the doors were hauled shut behind them, and the roar of 10,000 people was cut off all at once, as if a hand had closed over the world's mouth. And it was quiet. I came through the doors in the last press before they shut, and I turned and I saw it. The 6 of them, in the sudden hush of the great marble entrance hall, still standing in their arc, still not quite believing it was over, their chests heaving, the rain steaming off their red wool in the warmth of the light. And in the center of them the arch opened at last, the men stepping back and apart, and there in the middle of the marble floor stood Princess Elara, her dove-gray gown mud-streaked to the knee, her hair come down out of its pins, her face white but whole, unhurt, alive. She looked at the 6 men who had made a wall of themselves for her, and then she looked at Frey, who was swaying on his feet, one arm hanging wrong at his side, blood at the collar of his tunic where the camera had opened the skin, and who was even now trying to draw himself up to attention as though nothing had happened, as though a corporal did not report to Princess in a state of collapse. "Sit down," Elara said to him, not a request. It was the only order I ever heard her give in that voice, the voice of the house, the voice that is obeyed. "You will sit down, corporal, before you fall down. That is a command." And Aldous Frey, who had disobeyed the ceremonial book from the first second of the crisis to the last, obeyed this one order at once, and sat down on the marble floor of the opera house, and put his head down between his knees, and let his hands shake at last, now that there was no longer any reason to hold them still. The king was there within the minute. Alaric had come down the grand stair the moment the doors shut, and he crossed the marble hall faster than a man his age had any business moving, and he came to his daughter and took her by the shoulders and looked at her, all over, the way a father does counting her, making sure the number came out whole. And when he had satisfied himself that she was truly unhurt, he turned and looked at the 6 mud and rain-soaked men who had brought her to him, and the king of Eldermore. In front of his whole gathered house and a hall full of the kingdom's great, took off the thing he wore on his own breast, a small enameled star, an old campaign honor from his own soldiering days, the one decoration he never appeared without. And he crossed to where Frey sat on the floor, and he pressed it into the corporal's shaking hand, and closed the man's fingers over it, and said, in a voice not quite steady, "I have nothing here worth what you have done. This will have to stand for it until I can do better." That is the sort of thing that gets remembered, and it was remembered, and it was right. But it is not the heart of the story. The heart of the story is what happened in the next 10 minutes, in that same marble hall, while Frey sat on the floor and the rain still drummed on the shut doors, because it was in those 10 minutes that the Queen Consort undid herself, and did it in front of the only witnesses whose word could not be arranged away. Morwenna had come down the stair behind the king, more slowly. And she came now into the bright hall, into the middle of that scene of rescue and relief, and everyone in the hall turned to look at her, because she was the Queen Consort, and that is what a room does. And into the silence, for the hall had gone quiet, watching the king with the guardsmen, Morwenna spoke. She meant, I think, to seize the moment. That was always her instinct. She could not bear a scene in which the light fell on someone else, and here was the largest scene of her life with every light in it fixed on her stepdaughter and a corporal on the floor. So she stepped forward, and she pitched her voice to Carrie, and she said the thing she had prepared, which was a rebuke dressed as concern. "Well," she said, "what a spectacle. Elara, really, you might have simply come up the carpet as you were meant to, and none of this circus would have been necessary. You stopped. You waited for the crowd. You always must have your little moment with them and see what it costs: an evening in ruins, a good corporal hurt, and the whole gala turned into a brawl for the papers to feast on. One would almost think you enjoyed it. It was breathtaking, if you understand what she was doing. She was taking the bravest thing anyone in that hall had done, the princess's simple human warmth, her refusal to walk past 10,000 people who had waited for her, and she was turning it into the cause of the disaster. She was making Elara guilty of her own near death. And she was doing it in the low, reasonable, faintly grieved tone of a woman who only wants to see her stepdaughter behave, so that anyone who protested would seem to be the one making a scene. For a moment it nearly worked. The king half turned, torn, as he always was, between the daughter he loved and the wife he had grieved himself into needing. Elara herself went pale and said nothing. She had learned over years that answering Morwenna only fed her. But there was a man on the floor who had not learned that. Frey lifted his head. He was still sitting on the marble, still shaking, the king's little enameled star in one hand and the blood drying at his collar. And he looked up at the Queen Consort, and he said, in that flat northern voice, quietly, not loud at all, so that the whole hall had to go still to hear him, which it did. "That's not true, madam, and you know it isn't. You do not speak to the Queen Consort so. A corporal does not contradict a member of the house, and he certainly does not do it in a public hall, and every instinct of the guard I had served 11 years in screamed at me, watching, that Frey had just ended his career with 6 words. But Frey was past caring about his career. He had held a princess's life on the point of his shoulders for 2 minutes, and something in a man that survives that does not go back to holding its tongue. She stopped for the crowd, Frey said, because she is the only one of you they came to see, and she knew it, and she would not walk past them cold. That is not vanity. That is the opposite of it. The disaster was not that she stopped. The disaster was that the barrier failed, and the barrier failed because it was undermanned and underplanned, and I said so this afternoon and was laughed at." He drew a breath. It cost him something. "And I will tell you the other thing, madam, since we are telling the truth in this hall. I will tell you what you said on the steps while we brought her in." The hall did not breathe. Morwenna's face had gone very white and very still. I said nothing, she said. You are hurt, corporal, and raving. Someone see him to a doctor. You said, Frey went on, and now his voice was not quiet at all. Now it filled the marble hall to its high ceiling. Tell the guard to stand down. She is causing a scene. Let her walk it herself. You stood on those steps, madam, and you watched a crowd close over your husband's daughter, and your instruction to the household was to open the shield and let her take her chances in it, because her danger was making her the center of the evening, and you could not abide that even at the price of her life. He turned his head. The man you said it to is standing by the doors. Ask him under oath if it comes to that. I heard it carry over 40 feet of screaming crowd because I have spent my life listening for exactly that kind of order, the kind that gets people killed, and I will not sit on this floor and hear the woman who gave it call the princess the author of her own murder. Every head in the hall turned to the doors. The man standing there was the household officer Morwenna had spoken to on the steps, a gray, careful, frightened man named Dovril, who had served the house 30 years and had never in his life been the thing a whole room was looking at. And Dovril stood there with the eyes of the king and the queen consort and the crown prince and the whole gathered gala upon him, and he faced the oldest and worst choice a servant can face, which is whether to protect his mistress or tell the truth, and I watched him make it. He began. His voice failed. He tried again. The corporal is, and he looked at the king, and he looked at the princess, muddy and white and alive, and he looked at the 6 men steaming in the light, and something in the old servant, some last thing that 30 years of arranging and deferring had not quite worn away, straightened his spine. The corporal, said Dovril, is telling the truth, Majesty. Her Grace instructed me to have the guard stand down. I refused. I would refuse again. I have stood in some quiet rooms in my life. I have stood the death watch over a dying colonel, and I have stood the 2 in the morning post in an empty throne room, and I have stood at attention through a funeral in a rain that never once let up. But I have never known a silence like the one that came down over that marble hall when an old servant told the king of Eldermore that his wife had ordered a princess left to a crowd. Alaric turned to Morwenna very slowly. He was an old man and a tired one, and a man who had spent 6 years teaching himself not to see the thing that everyone below stairs could see, because to see it would have meant to be alone again, and he had been alone once, and it had nearly killed him. And I watched, in that silence, the willful blindness of 6 years crack across like ice on a pond when the thaw comes, all at once, from edge to edge. Is it true? The king said. It was not really a question. His voice had gone to a place I had never heard it go. Morwenna might yet have saved something, even then, if she had wept, or lied better, or fallen at his feet. But Morwenna was not built to bend, and pride is a poor counselor in the moment it is most needed. She drew herself up and her chin came up, and the mask came off her face entirely at last, and what was under it was the thing I had seen from 40 feet on the steps, not shame, not fear, but affront. She humiliates this house every time she goes among them, Morwenna said, and her voice shook, but with anger, not with sorrow. You do not see it because you are her father. Every simpering wave, every name she remembers, every rose they throw, it is all a performance to make the rest of us small, and it works, Alaric, it works. They went silent for me tonight, silent, and they will name streets for her, and I am to stand on the steps and watch and applaud. I told the man to let the guard stand aside so that she might, for one single evening, be inconvenienced by the crowd she is forever courting. She was in no true danger. She is never in danger. She is charmed. Nothing touches her. She was breathing hard. I did not tell anyone to harm her. I only told them to stop protecting her from the consequence of her own vanity. She was 6 inches, said Frey from the floor quietly, from a metal camera at the base of her skull. I have the mark of it on my own neck to show you what it would have done to hers. He said it without heat. He said it the way you correct a fact. And it was the most damning thing said in that hall all night, because it was simply and unanswerably true, and everyone in the room understood in the same instant that she is never in danger. was a lie a woman had told herself so that she could hate a girl in peace. The king looked at his wife for a long moment. And then he did the thing that ended it, not with a shout, for Alaric was past shouting, but with 3 quiet sentences that traveled the marble hall like a bell. "You will go to your rooms," he said. "You will not appear at my side again until I have decided what is to be done, and you will not decide it for me this time, as you have decided everything else these 6 years. And you will understand, madam, before you go, that tonight you asked my guard to lower their arms and let my daughter fall, and my guard, who owe you their obedience, refused you, and were right to refuse you, and I would sooner break the crown off my own head than say one word against them for it." He turned his back on her. That, in the language of that house, was the whole of it. A king does not turn his back. He had turned his. Morwenna stood one moment more in the middle of the bright hall, in her bruise-colored gown, with the whole kingdom's regard turned to stone against her. And then she went up the grand stair, alone, her heels very loud in the quiet, and no one moved to help her and no one said a word. And the last I saw of her that night was the dark shape of her at the top of the stair, pausing, looking back down at the scene of her defeat. The muddy princess, the 6 red men, the old king with his back turned, the corporal on the floor with a star in his hand. And whatever she saw there, she took it up the stair with her into the dark, and I do not think she ever put it down again. The board of inquiry sat 3 weeks later, and it is because of that board that I can tell you the parts of this night I did not see with my own eyes, the reflection in the glass, the words on the steps, the count under Frey's breath. The inquiry had been called on paper to determine why 6 guardsmen had abandoned their assigned posts and laid hands upon a member of the royal house in violation of the ceremonial book. That was the charge, in the dry language of the thing. 6 men had broken every rule of the parade ground, and rules broken must be examined, and there were officers of the old school who wanted the 6 of them reprimanded on principle. Because a guard that decides for itself when the book applies is a guard that has stopped being a guard. I gave my evidence to that board, and so did a dozen others, and so did the household officer Dovril, and so, when he was well enough, did Aldous Frey. And I will tell you how the board came out, because it is the last turn of the story and it matters. They cleared them, all 6. But they did more than clear them, and the more is the thing that changed the guard for a generation. The presiding officer was Princess Elara, the king's own sister, a woman of the house who had spent her life around soldiers and understood them, and who had been given the inquiry precisely because she could not be leaned on by the Queen Consort's remaining friends. And Elara listened to 3 weeks of evidence, and at the end of it she set down her papers and said a thing that is written now in the front of the ceremonial book itself, on a page that did not exist before that spring. "The book," she said, "is a good servant and a bad master. It was written by men who imagined they could foresee every crisis and write a rule for each. They could not. No one can. There will always come a night the book did not foresee, and on that night a guard has only 2 things to steer by, his discipline and his conscience. And the whole worth of the man is in whether he can tell, in the half-second he is given, which rule to keep and which to break. Corporal Frey broke the letter of the book on the night in question in order to keep its soul, which is the protection of the innocent and the honor of the crown. He is not to be reprimanded. He is to be studied. And the drill he devised without leave and taught without orders, the shield, is from this day part of the training of every guardsman in the king's service, and it will bear his name. They call it the Frey cordon now. Every man who comes into the household guard learns it in his first year, the arc, the locked shoulders, the keystone, the backward walk, the 2-word command. Most of them never learn where it came from. It is only a drill to them, a thing they do on wet mornings on the square, cursing the mud. But it came from a quiet man from the northern moors who could not stop cleaning his gloves, who felt the weather turning an hour before the rain, and who decided one soft season, when no one had asked him to, that he would be ready if the worst ever came. And because he decided that, on a night years later, A princess walked out of a crowd that should have taken her. As for the men, Old Crane took his bad knee into an honorable retirement that spring, and he dined out on that night for the rest of his days and earned every dinner. Doran Sabe, the boy barely a year off the square, who had gone in with the wide white eyes, Doran made sergeant inside 2 years and is a sergeant major now, and they say there is no steadier man in a crisis in the whole guard, and I believe it because I saw where he learned it. Ansel Rook carries the scar above his eye still and is proud of it and lies cheerfully about how he got it. Piers Loom, who threw his arm across the gap when the keystone fell, became Frey's closest friend and stood up at his wedding 4 years on. And I Ren Halloran, who stood 40 feet back and could not reach them. I have carried, all these years, the one thing that night taught me, which is that the worst distance in the world is the distance you cannot close to a person in danger, and that the whole point of a brotherhood like ours is to make sure that on any given night someone can. Frey himself mended slowly. The camera had cracked a bone in his shoulder and bruised the great muscles of his neck, and for a long month he could not lift his arm above his head, and there were doctors who said quietly that he might never stand a full post again. But Frey had spent his life making his body answer him, and it answered him one more time, and he came back, and he stood his post, and he served 9 more years and rose to sergeant major of the 2nd section, and trained a generation of young men in a drill that bore his own name, and he never once in all that time told the story of where it came from. He thought the story belonged to the princess, not to him. That was Frey. Princess Elara did not forget. She was not a woman who forgot. In the years that followed, she made a quiet study of the 6 men who had shielded her, and she was there. Every one of the 6 will tell you, at the weddings and the christenings, and when it came, at Old Crane's funeral, standing at the back in plain gray so as not to make it about herself, though everyone knew her. And once a year, on the anniversary of that night, she sent to the muster room of the 2nd section a single thing, with no card and no need of one. A heavy old-fashioned camera, all metal and glass, of exactly the kind that had come out of the crowd. It was a strange gift and a dark joke and a profound one all at once, and the men understood it, and they kept them, a growing row of them on a shelf in the muster room, one for every year the princess had lived that she would not have lived but for 6 men and an arch. There are a great many cameras on that shelf now. She lived a long time. The king, in the end, did what he had said he would do, and did it slowly, and did it thoroughly so that it could not be undone. Morwenna did not return to his side. There was no scandal made of it, for that was not Alaric's way. There was only, over the following year, a quiet and complete unmaking of everything she had spent 6 years arranging. The seating restored, the invitation set right, the light allowed to fall where it truly belonged. She kept her title and her rooms and her dignity, for the king was not a cruel man and would not strip her bare before the kingdom. But she never again decided who stood where in the photographs, and the girl she could not bear to see loved was loved, from that spring onward, more openly and more fiercely than ever, by a kingdom that had watched 6 of its guardsmen make a wall of themselves for her and had understood, all at once and forever, exactly what she was worth. I go to the long gallery of the old barracks sometimes still, in my retirement, and I stand before the photograph in its plain black frame, the 6 red backs, the rain, the columns, the woman you cannot see. The young men pass it every day and do not know. And I think, standing there, that this is perhaps the truest picture of what we were, we of the guard, not the parade, not the polished boots, not the still faces the tourists came to photograph. This. 6 men with their backs to the camera and their faces to the danger, forming a wall around a life, asking no one's leave, expecting no one's thanks, because a girl who remembered the names of strangers was worth more than any rule in any book, and because one quiet man from the moors had decided, long before, that if the worst ever came, he would be the one standing in the way of it. He was, and she lived. And that in the end is the whole of the honor and the whole of the story, and I have told it now, and I am content.